So I did my usual thing where I woke up this morning, I said, let's change the whole speech. It was called something else. But when I first started thinking about giving this talk, it was a little bit before Christmas time, and I thought I'd be really clever and cheat, and get some of my smart Latin American friends over for, you know, a pre-Christmas dinner, and pick their brains and see what they thought. So I said, so we're all very sort of heavily political and love to talk about economics and politics and all the things you're not supposed to discuss over Christmas dinner, but we do, with much rum being consumed. And so I said, you know, here's the thing. When we think about our region, when we think about Latin America, I said, we have, I sort of love to quip and in Washington, D.C. and say, you know, we don't really need the rest of the world. We can just focus on the Western Hemisphere. Because the Western Hemisphere is sort of the poor nephew in Washington, D.C. policy-making circles, right? Doesn't get the attention that, say, the Middle East does. I said, we have everything. We have all your fossil fuels, all your ingredients for renewables. We have, you know, a young demographic, young workforce, coastlines facing every major market, Asia, Europe, North America. And there's constant joke is that we're the region of the future and always will be. Somehow never quite live up to the promise. And I said, you know, and the other thing we hear all the time, especially in Washington, D.C. policy-making circles, is how terrible it is that China is making incursions into Latin America, whereas the U.S., when the U.S. is receding. And I said, you know, maybe what we need to do is to take a page out of NAFTA or the EU and bind together and, you know, pool our economic power together, and instead of being picked apart and negotiated one by a force such as China, we can rise up. Well, this just about ended the dinner, right, friends? No, absolutely not. You've obviously spent too much time in the United States if you think like that. You have no understanding that a Mexican can never really do business with a Chilean. You know, Mexicans take 4 lunches and 3 dinners to make a decision. Chileans do it, you know, from 11:15 to 11:45. So I said, well, anyway, I poured some more rum. Everybody calmed down. And then I thought, I seem to have hit a nerve here. And I still wanted to get to the bottom of why is it that the region hasn't quite lived up to it. And rather than be discussed as the turf in the economic war between the US and China, how do we go from, instead of being the bone that the US and China fight over, how do we instead rise up and be one of the dogs? How do we empower the region and say, we want to be taken seriously? This is a question that we should confront right now because we're at a number of crossroads. Politically, we had the major economies in the region voted in political outsiders. They want an electorate that was sick of the political system as it was here in Mexico, and also in Brazil, is particularly what I have in mind. We've done a lot of work in Brazil. And to achieve greater security and corruption, the usual, bring in greater social justice and inequality, or at least improve inequality. And then you also have different economic trends. So I said, well, given my day job, which is sort of political risk advisory, let's go about this systematically. Let's look at what are the changing trends of how the world sees us, particularly how investors see us. What are the changing commercial relationships with our region? Where do we stand? Where are our strengths and our weaknesses? And then what solutions do we need to implement in order to maximize our share of global prosperity? How do we improve the lot of our people, of our economies, and our communities. So, because I work a lot of sort of anti-corruption, yet pro-business, we're always trying to find the sweet spot between businesses and communities rather than putting them at odds. So what I've come up with is the following. The traditional story, for instance, let's focus on Chinese investment. And as a Venezuelan, we know a thing or two about Chinese money entering our country. The traditional story is that they come in and that they have bought a lot of commodities. Now that has shifted. That is still somewhat true. But you see that the trend is now increasingly into more nuanced and graduated investments into things like real estate for rent and manufacturing, service industry. And they're getting more into sort of, and they are getting into, have done a lot of infrastructure and to lower the costs for their trade into the Pacific trade routes. But they're also getting into commercial banking, opening commercial banks here. So between the real estate, the financial services, and investing also into joint ventures and M&A here, it's putting different pressures on the demands of the workforce and our financial structures here in Latin America. Particularly, one of the most interesting investments that I've found of last year was a company called Didi Chuxing, which is basically China's Uber, bought Brazil's Uber, known as 99. Not just because they wanted to expand into Latin America, which they did, but they wanted to buy the algorithms. Because the Brazilian company's algorithms had something that was of interest to the Chinese artificial intelligence program, that when brought together, they realized that they could map out better urban planning, not just in China, but then they could offer this service on into advising governments in other parts of the world. So that fit with their strategic interests. Now there's more searching for that type of opportunity around Latin America. That's great in some ways, because it means that we as communities have the opportunity to benefit from trade that is quite frankly higher value added. It's not just, hey, let me dig a bunch of stuff out of the ground, put it on a boat, and you pay me as little as you possibly can for it, right? This is stuff that puts more money, could put more money in the pockets of the people and promotes education, or should promote education. But our communities are not well positioned to meet this need. Latin American community educational system is about 2.5 years behind the OECD average. Compared on a per capita basis, we are about 3 years of schooling behind Vietnam, which is shocking, frankly. And so we need to educate our people more and improve that. The other thing I found is that those mental blocks about Mexicans and Chileans can't possibly do business together. I said, of course they can. They're part of the Pacific Alliance. The Pacific Alliance is meant to be a free trade agreement, is a free trade agreement, between Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. And it's supposed to be the wave of the future, right? And integrated legal systems. You can set up a company in one consulate of one country and have it abide by all the same rules. And it's amazing, and it's going to bring advancement. Here's the thing, it hasn't really worked out that way. The countries really, the trade amongst themselves is only 3.2%. They're still basically stuck in selling most of commodities to China, which is not in the Pacific Alliance yet. So why are we stuck? It seems that the other problem that is facing us, that is interfering with our ability to really benefit from a globalization in trade and free trade, is also that mental closedness has translated into real economic closed systems. Globally, about 56% of GDP comes from trade. In Latin America, it's only 42%. In Brazil, which is the biggest and the most closed economy in Latin America, it's only 24%, and they have the highest tariffs and 1,800 other non-tariff trade barriers. So we need to, the mental closeness has translated into a protectionism. And the World Economic Forum has cited that one of the big problems with Latin American competitiveness on the world stage, on the world economic markets, is the fact that you don't have the availability of reliable infrastructure, border administration, and other transportation services, right? The availability, the notable exception, of course, is Panama. So that's number two. One is education. The other is economics, trade barriers, and protectionism. And it seems to me that we need to, that the poor infrastructure and the poor education is also related to that third thing, which is always the 800-pound gorilla in the room in Latin America. And it starts with the letter C. Huh? Corruption. That's right. Corruption. So corruption is what holds all of us back. And it is the consequences of corruption are pervasive throughout society, throughout all of state functions. Its consequences are devastating, right? In a judicial system that does not advocate for the rights of its citizens, poor educational system, poor health care, greater inequality, and the privileges, the growing privileges of the few are quite literally written on the bodies of the millions of people who feel trapped in a system in which they cannot rise. And ultimately, it becomes, a human rights problem. So, in response to what is it going to take for us to rise up and be one of the dogs, we need to take 3 steps, 3 things. One is brains. The brains to educate our youth so that they can have a share of that prosperity. So instead of being reliant on a system of a paternalistic economic system where they have to beg for their privileges, that they can go out and have a sense of dignity and participate in a growing economy and help build it for themselves and help participate in that system where you have a growing demand for services, a growing demand for banking, for real estate, for the next Uber ride-hailing app or whatever it may be, instead of just digging a hole in the ground and putting a bunch of copper ore on a truck or whatever. We also need to have the brains to overcome our nationalistic impulses. I mean, hey, you know, if a German can deal with a Greek, barely, you know, I'm sure we can get a Mexican and a Chilean to close a business deal together. So, to overcome our differences and to focus on the things that we want and our strategic objectives. The second thing is balls. Balls. To confront corruption, to call it out, to demand better of our leaders, but also to demand better of ourselves. So much of the problem in Latin America, speaking as a Latin American, is the cultural acceptance of it. You can't just elect new presidential leaders and say, I want you not to be corrupt and to end it all, but then participate in corruption yourself or briberies. You need to understand that the consequences of each and every one of our behaviors creates the environment in which we operate, creates the economic system. It creates the consequences of the world around us. It is why you wake up one morning because you engage in that sort of, oh, I'll just do a little side deal. I'll just buy from the, the smuggler at the corner and all of that, that you, with your money and with your choices, you're feeding corruption. And that's why you wake up one morning and the police don't come. You need to have the balls also to confront the people who take advantage of corruption, which is, if you follow my work, I'm talking a lot about transnational organized crime, and balls to overcome that community sense of short-termism that's so typical of Latin America. And infrastructure. Yeah, like the sticks and bones of our economy. Those things like focusing more on regional free trade agreements, really making them work, increasing, border administration, better data, better information, better communication technology, and to speed up those transactions and to improve transparency. I'm slightly speeding through this. This is, I've written on the topic, but to improve transparency, and that will help fight the corruption, speed up the growth and prosperity, and give us a growing sense of regional community, and give us the strength to confront the challenges of a changing global investment environment in a way that will bring greater economic inclusion to our people. And Latin America, I firmly believe, is at a crossroads because of the political environment and the new leadership that the people have chosen. They have spoken, and the way the world is viewing us has changed. And it is time for us to step up and live up to the promise of what we could be and make businesses and communities prosper through brains, balls, and infrastructure. Thank you.